Welcome everyone to the Evacuation Planning and Outreach webinar. This is part 2 of a 2-part series. Today's webinar features 3 research teams studying evacuation. Part 1 of this series, highlighting stories from 3 practitioners, will be available on our YouTube channel soon. We hosted that September 16th. So if you missed it, you'll still have an opportunity to check it out on the FACnet YouTube channel. This presentation is hosted by the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, or FACnet, and we are a nationwide network of wildfire adaptation practitioners supported by a partnership between the U.S. Forest Service, the Department of the Interior, the Nature Conservancy, the Watershed Research and Training Center. We support communities around the country who are working on wildfire adaptation and provide learning, training, funding, and capacity building opportunities to our members. My name is Annie Schmidt, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. I am joining today from beautiful North Central Washington. This is the land of the Pasquosa, now known as the Wenatchee, whose people have stewarded and continue to steward this land, its water, and its fire. And I'd like to invite us all to reflect on and support the people who are indigenous to the places where we now live. I also want to take a moment to introduce the support team for this webinar. From FACnet today, in addition to myself, we have Michelle Medley-Daniel, Emily Troisi, and Maddie Smith here to help moderate the chat and facilitate our small group breakout sessions. If anyone needs technical support during the webinar, please private chat one of them. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar, like the first in the series, will be made available on the FACnet YouTube channel. And if you enjoy our conversation today and want to learn more about what we do or participate more with FACnet, there'll be an opportunity to do so a little bit later. So lastly, before we get into the real content for the day, I want to set a few participant agreements. Everyone here today is a teacher and everyone is a learner. We'd like everyone to be inquisitive and to ask questions. Please do be respectful in the chat box. Participants during the first half of today's webinar will stay muted with their cameras off until we get to the breakout rooms, when there will be more opportunities for interaction. While in the breakout rooms, we do encourage everyone to turn their camera on if you feel comfortable and ask questions, and being mindful of the respectful learning environment that we try to maintain. Be kind, share space, and respect the learning of one another. Over the next 90 minutes, we will have the opportunity to hear from 3 knowledgeable research teams. For those of you who are new to FACnet, this is only the start of the conversation. This is a huge field, and there's a ton of wonderful research out there to support communities that are seeking to plan more effectively for evacuation. And we do already have some insights from another researcher, Dr. Sarah McCaffrey, already featured on our YouTube channel, specifically about evacuation. You will notice that among the panelists, their areas of research, their focal areas are different. And this is intentional, as we want to highlight a variety of insights provided by our research partners. We've tried to keep the questions that we have for them broad in the main panel discussion to allow opportunities for each of them to weigh in. And you'll have an opportunity to ask more specific questions either during the audience portion of the panel discussion or those small group breakout rooms. We hope that you will walk away from today's webinar with some interest in continuing to share and connect. And if you want to share about the evacuation planning work that you're doing, please let us know. So the first presenters that we have with us today are Dr. Fang and Dr. Karin Riley. Dr. Fang is currently a lecturer in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her work focuses on the intersection of urban forestry, urban environmental planning, and GIS spatial modeling. As an expert in GIS and remote sensing applications in urban forests, Dr. Fang's research has explored the spatial pattern of urban street trees from the space. Her work also answers how to identify tree species diversity and their health status using satellite images, which can help us build a more livable and sustainable community. Dr. Karin Riley is a research ecologist with the Forest Service Fire Lab in Missoula, Montana. She's been working in fire modeling since 2009, with much of her work focusing on the intersection of climate and large fire occurrence. She has applied fire modeling to problems faced during active fire incidents, as well as in planning for the effects on climate change. Dr. Riley also applies machine learning technologies to the mapping of forest vegetation. With that, I will turn it over to you, Karin and Fang.
All right, great. Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
Good deal. Well, I am honored to kick off this webinar today. It's been great working with these folks at FactNet. And I am really excited to learn from all the people on this call today. I see a lot of people with really incredible experience here. As Annie said, my experience is more in fire modeling, and I'm a little newer to the evacuation world. And what happened, what the impetus was for this was the Paradise Fire that occurred in November 2018. And I'm sure you all remember that fire. Sorry, the campfire in Paradise, California. And of course, that was really a tragedy that killed 88 people and destroyed over 18,000 structures. That really moved me and my colleagues to do this work on evacuation risk. In particular, John Kim and Alex Dye, our two colleagues who couldn't be here today, and they came up with the idea for this study as something that we could potentially do as researchers to prevent this kind of disaster in the future. So what we did is make an evacuation vulnerability screening tool for rural towns in Washington and Oregon. And I'll talk a little bit about the metrics that we included in this. Of course, I think in thinking about this, it's important to mention that these are, of course, all fire adapted ecosystems in Washington and Oregon. I think our thinking as researchers is really moving away from eliminating fire on the landscape, as I know many of you in the management world are too, because they're appropriate here. But what we want to prevent are these kind of tragedies, such as what happened in Paradise. One option during those kind of tragedies is to try to leave the area. Evacuating in a personal vehicle is usually how that happens in the US. So that's the lens at which we're looking at this study. I'm going to tell you just a little about the two wildfire hazard metrics that we employed here. Those are fire intensity and burn probability. And we got those from the Large Fire Simulator model, or FSIM. I know a lot of you are familiar with that model. And the outputs were provided by our colleagues at Pyrologics. So what FSIM does more or less is it gives you 10,000 or as many iterations as you want of what fire season might look like next year. And it does that by statistically simulating ignitions, fire spreads, weather, and fire suppression. So from that stack of possible simulations of what next year's fire season might look like, we can draw the likely fire intensity from a surface fire up to a crown fire, and also the likelihood of burning at any particular place on the map. So we reasoned here that areas that are likely to have fire intensity probably have more evacuation vulnerability, and then areas that have higher burn probability probably also have higher evacuation hazard. So then I want to turn it over to Fang to talk about our road quality metrics here.
Hey, can everyone hear me well? Hello, this is Fang calling from University of Illinois. So I'm going to continue to introduce the other 4 road quality metrics we used here. So as Karin mentioned, we basically evaluate evacuation vulnerability score based on 2 sets of metrics. One is from wildfire hazard, another one is from road quality. Actually, we're trying to fill the gap between these 2. So regardless of what wild hazard level they have, let's purely look at road quality. Here we break it down into 4 different metrics. These metrics are GS-based concepts, which can help us to better understand the road conditions there for each town. And again, these metrics are independent per town. So let's first look at exit capacity. The exit capacity, actually we're calculating is a pure count of how many paved roads are there per town within a certain distance. Here we use 15 kilometers as a radius and to do a count of how many paved lanes they have. Of course, here, this one is straightforward. The more lanes you have, the higher number you got, you're gonna have a relative lower vulnerability in terms of evacuation, right? But that's not the single metrics we're considering. The next, we move to road directionality. Because think about this scenario, even though you have thousands of lanes go from your center of your city, your town, but how about all of them are moving toward the same direction, say toward the east? In this case, actually, you're more vulnerable compared with if I have fewer lanes, but these lanes all pointing toward different directions can take me to anywhere. All right, so that's why we calculate road directionality, which way quantifying how many different directions we can go based on the current paved roads. And next, we move to the travel area. This concept actually is equivalent to the concept of service area in GIS context. Again, every time we assume we're sitting right in the center of the town and we move, we're trying to travel outwards. The travel area actually measures the size, how far you can reach within 15 kilometers traveling distance. For example, if you have a lot of paved roads in your town and you have to take a lot of turns when you're traveling from the center point and try to evacuate. Actually, it won't help too much if you're taking so many turns and the road is so complicated, because in fact, 15 kilometers pure travel distance won't take you too far away from the center. Compared with, assume we'll have just one lane that is purely straight from the center, right? So 15 kilometers distance actually can take you 15 kilometers away from the center. So that's why the area, the size you can reach within such a distance also matters, help us to quantify. The larger area, the better. That means within a certain distance, you can travel a little bit further for the evacuation plans. And the last metrics we consider here is connectivity. That is a sum of total lanes that intersect within each buffer, each 15 kilometers radius buffer. This one also measures if the higher number, that gonna indicate you have more options to go to different directions during the evacuation. So all these four measures our road quality, both in quantity, directions, and the size, and spatial patterns, can help us to better understand, regardless of what kind of pattern you have, what is the road conditions per town. And we do rank them purely on the road quality. And then after that, we integrate these scores with wildfire scores to help us get an overall score to rank all the towns. Should I move to Karin? Do you want to go to the next?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and as Fun mentioned, we give about 50% weight to wildfire hazard, 50% to road quality. Here's what the outputs look like. And we have just about used up our time. So I'm just going to give you the briefest tour, and we can always come back to this later in the breakout room. It's also on the web if you want to surf around and see individual scores for each of the towns. You can look at the 4 road quality metrics individually, the 2 fire hazard metrics individually, and then the overall scores. We've divided them into 4 quantiles here. Let's just go ahead and skip to the overall. And we'll look at the integration of these 2 patterns for road quality and fire hazard. And where you see kind of the highest vulnerability is down here in the Klamath of Oregon. I hope you can see my pointer, the Blue Mountains, and then northeastern Washington. And these are areas where you tend to have a confluence of perhaps restricted directions to get out because you have mountainous topography, and then either high burn probability or high flame lengths. And then the lower risk areas tend to be south of Seattle and in the Willamette Valley here in Oregon, where you tend to have less constrained topography and lower burn probabilities. And I want to make the note that we're not saying that any of these places have zero hazard. As we said, these are fiery ecosystems. So these all have some amount of risk. And with that, I will turn the reins back over to Annie.
Thank you so much, Karin and Fang, for that great presentation. So at this time, I would very much like to introduce our next research team. Shefali and Boyd will be sharing highlights from their working group's recently published research report on wildfire preparedness and evacuation planning in a pandemic. Shefali is the co-founder of Wonder Labs, a California-based social enterprise working to catalyze innovation with communities on the front line of climate impacts. Earlier this year, Shefali launched the Reimagining 2025 Living with Fire Design Challenge to center the voices of students and early career researchers in community wildfire risk reduction efforts. She is also advisor to Zone Haven on developing inclusive evacuation planning and management platforms. Boyd Labeda is a field liaison in the smoke management program at the Department of Public Health and Environment in Colorado. He worked for almost 30 years with the Colorado State Forest Service, where he delivered forestry services in the wildland-urban interface. Specializing in fire behavior, Boyd has been a critical part of wildfire planning and management over the last few years in Colorado. And now I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Annie. And thanks everyone for joining us here today. So our research objective was really to understand how communities prepare for and recover from wildfires during a deadly pandemic. And this topic was of interest to us because communities are increasingly faced with compound hazards and cascading disaster impacts. And all of this can have a pretty direct influence on how people practice safety and make decisions around preparedness, evacuation, sheltering, and returns. And so we agreed that this was an important experience to study and learn from. And with that objective in mind, we set out to understand how institutions and communities in two locations, that's Nevada County in California and Larimer County in Colorado, experienced the wildfire pandemic interface in this past year. I encourage you all to look at our report for more detailed insights on what we learned and, with respect to each case study location. But for now, I'll focus on three high-level findings and recommendations. So our first finding reveals that well-functioning partnerships and prior relationships really enabled local agencies and community networks to pivot and to be more responsive and agile, even in the face of great complexity. By way of example, early in 2020, local agencies across both case study locations pivoted to conducting virtual planning exercises remotely, often with smaller teams meeting in person. And we found that strong local leadership and clear, timely communication between local agencies actually played a really important role in achieving a coordinated response, both for the pandemic as well as the wildfires later in the year. And then on the community side, although evacuation drills had been planned for both locations in 2020, these of course had to be canceled due to the pandemic lockdowns. And yet we found that Firewise communities made up for the lack of in-person activities by hosting virtual town halls and creating regular opportunities for virtual discussions around household preparedness, including defensible space, evacuation planning, and public safety power shutoffs in the case of California. And all of these virtual discussions that built on prior relationships and partnerships really did make a difference in how neighborhoods prepared to evacuate at the time of the fires. And we found that being a part of this kind of collective work made it easier to plan for contingencies, even amidst all the complexity of the past year. But then the flip side of this new reliance on virtual modes of communication that built on these prior partnerships was that people who were not already part of these partnerships in the community got left out altogether, which brings us to the second finding. Our research confirms that experiences of social isolation, anxiety, and trauma from cascading disaster impacts can affect personal preparedness and evacuation decisions. We heard many narratives of people being tired, scared, depressed, panicked, like they were in a bad dream. And for some demographics, there was a general absence of personal connections and meaningful social interactions. This was especially the case among older adults, people with disabilities, people living in remote rural communities, in mobile homes, encampments. And this certainly affected how and if people could get help, especially during the evacuations. We found that too often people didn't have someone to count on. By way of example, a community disability advocate who conducts disaster preparedness outreach work with people with disabilities in Nevada County in California shared that their organization had adopted this messaging around find your 5 people who can support you during a disaster. But what they found during meetings with clients was that a lot of people just don't have 5 people in their lives. And this is where the work of community advocates really came in to support people with little or no access to care networks. And that brings me to our third significant finding, which is that neighbors, community groups, and voluntary networks are heroes too. There have been so many great examples of how community groups stepped up and plugged gaps at a time when institutional capacities have been stretched. For example, in Colorado, the North 40 Mountain Alliance, which is a volunteer-driven alliance, they started a food pantry, which was done to help a remote mountain community to get access to food at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns. People had lost their jobs, there was unemployment, food insecurity, and housing instability. And so the strategy of the Alliance early in 2020 was to get people food first. And then in parallel, to make up for the lack of wildfire preparedness outreach and community evacuation drills due to all the COVID-19 constraints, the Mountain Alliance started to hand out flyers and information about wildfire preparedness and evacuation planning. And so this made the food pantry the community's new disaster information hub, which then also had a major role in helping people evacuate and recover from the multiple fires that they saw in Larimer County. And so we found that the most positive outcomes were evident in communities that had these active volunteer networks and community-led actions in place. So with those findings in mind, I want to conclude by highlighting 3 recommendations as we all work our way through this evolving wildfire pandemic interface. Our first recommendation is to continue to create and maintain strong local partnerships that are informed by a holistic assessment of the social, ecological, and public health impacts of wildfires. COVID-19 has reinforced what we have long known, which is that no one institution operating in any one silo can do this alone. We need a more convergent approach to address these compounding disasters. And that's going to require us to think about evacuations as a social, ecological, and public health issue. Our second recommendation is to emphasize the need for more robust intersectional analysis of how diverse populations practice safety. Too often, we're telling people what to do. We're handing out checklists of do's and don'ts, but we're not truly listening to people's experiences and asking them about their preferences and how they actually practice and experience safety. And so we recommend co-learning with people from diverse backgrounds and creating opportunities to engage with diverse community perspectives on an ongoing basis. Our final recommendation is to invest in community infrastructure and bolster local capabilities to mitigate and adapt to these compounding disaster risk. Evacuation planning can only be successful in a resilient ecosystem that includes robust community transportation and infrastructure, well-maintained capabilities, and whole of society networks of care. As we witnessed in the past 18 months, no one is safe until everyone is safe. I'm going to stop there, and I really look forward to the discussion with all of you.
Thank you so much, Shefali. That was fantastic. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Staciewicz, Amanda Staciewicz, who is an assistant professor of wildfire management and policy with the Department of Environmental Studies at San Jose State University in California. She serves as the wildfire social scientist for the San Jose State's Wildfire Interdisciplinary Research Center and is co-director of the newly established Fire, Weather, and Wildfire Management focused NSF Industry University Cooperative Research Center. Her work broadly focuses on human adaptation to wildfire in the US West. Some of her current research investigates the challenges residents and professionals encountered during evacuation and response to recent wildfires in California. She will be joined today by Dr. Travis Paveglio, an associate professor in the College of Natural Resources at the University of Idaho. He has been researching human and policy dimensions of wildland fire for quite some years. I will turn it over to you both now.
All right, thank you. I'm going to get us started. Amanda and I decided to go in a slightly different direction here. I've been doing work on evacuation for 15 plus years, sometimes with Amanda, sometimes with others, and we're both doing that work. And so we wanted to focus on a few overarching lessons from that and use that as a springboard for what I think is the more exciting component of today, which is a back and forth with practitioners. And so we jump off from that point that our last presenter gave us very well, which is for those 15 years, we've really been focused on understanding how people make sense of the evacuation process, both professionals and the people who are receiving messages, how they break those down, what decisions they make and why. And it goes without saying that in the first component here is we're dealing with a very uncertain event with a lot of influences. And so this notion that it's a simple binary of making a choice to leave and where to go isn't always going to be an easy one. And we really stress to people that they need to understand the range of actions people are going to take in an event beforehand, and that that's going to vary across populations. In some places, we're asking people in their planning processes to figure out where your shelter point is or where you're evacuating to, what information is going to be most important in making your decision and how that sets the timing for when you leave, or whether or not there is an awareness of what our first presenters were talking about, which is the difficulty that you may face from infrastructure. So really the point here is I look when I'm doing interviews with residents now and I ask, what are you going to do during an evacuation, for them to say, well, it depends, because then I have the opening to really get into the elaboration that's necessary for us to have people who are responsible to any of those evacuation messages. In every fire I've been to and every fire I've studied and every fire that people tell me about, people stay. I went back to one of my very first papers, and for that 15 years, we have said more work needs to be done around people who are going to stay and defend, people who are waiting, people who are on the fence, recommendations of those people about what to do, research surrounding what is a safety zone for them when they can't get out. And that hasn't always been the primary focus. Now, I realize there are lots of challenges and reasons why that's done, but I think that's a dialogue that's really important to have with practitioners here. Go ahead, Amanda.
Yeah, so when we're talking about evacuation intentions and evacuation approaches, it's going to be a part of the conversation of what is the motivation for staying and why are people potentially hesitating to stay. And a lot of the work that Travis has been doing and I've been able to integrate into has had to do with different archetypes of people, different types of communities that are going to deal with fire risks differently. And one of the pictures on this slide in particular is showing one side of that extreme that we've encountered, which is ranching communities in rural areas of Idaho and Oregon that we're seeing their livelihoods go up in smoke, and we're going out and responding to fires on federal lands to protect their grazing allotments. Instead of that conflict continuing and creating a maladaptive fire space, the way the state, the feds, and locals have come together is getting them their FFT2 certifications, and now they use their own equipment to respond to fires on public lands or their private lands. So it created this filler for a fire capacity, suppression capacity kind of void, filling in some of those gaps in their responsibility areas. This operating in a different space with more WUI looks a little different. They turn into a local knowledge source and they help with evacuating cattle and getting resources out of the way. So that's going to look very different in some of your gated communities or some of your mountain communities, right? There's going to be different challenges there with evacuation and motivation. So that's important. And when we're thinking about that, it's also important that we think about how do we enable them to do these things safely. If people can tie in with partnerships with the state and feds, that's fantastic. So we can have those transparent conversations about communication, about safety concerns. But if we can't do that, a lot of folks from the work Travis and I have been doing, some of the work I'm doing up in the Santa Cruz Mountains right now, some of the lightning complex fires from last summer, is people are not getting notifications because of conditions of rurality, not enough service coverage. So they've doubled down. They're using MERS and ham radios to increase their ability to get everybody out. They're also looking for fire weather information that they're not getting in your code red notifications, right? They're looking to neighbors and other sources to figure out, can I stay and defend? Or do I need a shelter in place? Where's the fire at? So one of the ways we can potentially increase our ability to have these resilience response landscapes in the future is thinking about how can we tailor the messaging and the information to the people and what they need. Back to Travis.
So this notion of simple messages or technologies there, having looked at evacuation for a long time, there's a lot of really good work that's done and new slogans or new PR work. And one of my backgrounds is in communication. And again, going back to that is I was actually around before Ready, Set, Go was the thing, doing research on evacuation. And so, this idea of simple messages that will convey a quick understanding for people to make these complex decisions is a good entry point. But it's usually only that. And what's necessary beyond that is a lot of that other information. The same is true with any type of evacuation technology that people put forward, whether it's reverse 911, whether it's now Zone Haven in California. These are great advancements in ways that we can reach people. However, in all of the instances that we've gone to and studied the after effects of evacuation and how those things worked out, there are hiccups, there are problems, there are misunderstandings of those. And that really points itself to a lot of a refinement of these conditions and a refinement of these tools, but also this deeper responsibility that people can be a part of that process. And so for a lot of that time, Amanda and I and others have looked at what are the conditions of these communities that are going to make them more responsive to certain strategies than others, or better able to organize at the grassroots to maybe set up their own sheltering points in an area, or be able to notify each other with decision trees and those kind of things. Go ahead, Amanda.
No, I think that is going to be everything that we really need, especially some of the communities that I've been in recently have kind of had probably about 1/10 of the community stay and defend in recent lightning complex fires, and now the communities are training themselves up and they've actually tripled that capacity. They have over 100 out of the 500 people that live in an area planning to stay and defend next time and getting self-training to do that. So that's one of the ways that we need, I think moving forward is, if people are going to be doing this, how do we figure that out for emergency professionals and fire service?
One last point, and that's in the paper that we have, and it's gone across many, and I hope to talk with people more about this, is we have looked across evacuation, people would intend to stay and defend, people who we call shelter in place or don't know, and people are going to evacuate early. And across multiple states, with a lot of samples from surveys, we have documented that there's a very different level of preparation that people take in the home ignition zone, or to plan for where they're going to go, or to establish firefighting resources, or to set up conditions that are going to make it safe for responders to come in and actually help protect those structures. And so that's something that I would be happy to answer more questions about and give people evidence of. Thank you.
Okay, so for the next few minutes, we are going to have some audience questions. Some of these are coming from pre-registration questions that we got from folks, and then some of them from the chat box as well. So the first one is, how can knowledge gained from your work help inform more effective evacuation? I know you all sort of touched on this a little bit, but I'll open up to see if anybody would like to jump in. That question?
Ask it to me again.
Yeah, how can the knowledge gained from your work help inform more effective evacuation?
Sure, well, I can tell you some of the ways in which we have. For instance, in a particular case study that we did in Idaho years ago, this was one of the very first Firewise communities that was established, and those folks had a very difficult infrastructure to deal with in terms of wildfire. They also had a very long kind of wait for people to be able to come and fight fire, and they were very worried about fires that began near their interface to public lands. And so they did have a very active volunteer fire department, and they had established their own neighborhood safer places, a residence within this very sprawling neighborhood in the mountains, where they would come together and they were going to stay and defend. And they would then go back and be able to help each other out in that process because they knew they couldn't leave. And that was one of those instances where it's people who are actually adapting to the situation they have, and just going in and telling them, you must evacuate. Well, they would say, where, right? And you can fast forward to many years later, and Amanda and I were in California this summer doing interviews with different communities that we chose for very different types of social context, where in one place, the challenge there was the legacy of infrastructure, where there would not be an ability for these people to evacuate, even if they could all evacuate. It was horrible road conditions, and there was also going to be a bottleneck at the highways. And these folks really need some other way in which they can have some work done to help them plan for this inevitability of evacuation. And both of those communities, by the way, were put under evacuation orders about 3 weeks after Amanda and I left, and we were getting pictures and calls, and we're hopefully going to go back and work with people on what some next steps would be. So plenty of examples, but I'll let others go.
Awesome. Yeah, go ahead, Boyd.
Yeah, I would just add that's a really great template. Just making the most out of previous incidents, previous fire evacuation notices or mandatory evacuation, and just reflecting on how that went, and just trying to get the most you can out of those past experiences to be talking with people about what's coming in the future.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I'd like to jump off that really quick. Some of the work in the social science side, a lot of you mentioned in the chat that you have recent evacuation experiences. Now is the time to be having those conversations. We know from the social science literature that you have about 2 to 5 years after a fire of heightened capacity and awareness in the community to actually make those changes. So it's really great to have you all here, because this is the time to start thinking about creating that resilience in your community that's going to last until the next fire.
Karin, did you want to add something as well?
I can add something. I think from our standpoint, we were hoping that that tool we produced was sort of a starting point for discussions. It is a product in and of itself, but it's definitely not the final product. We're hoping that it helps to raise awareness at what types of challenges communities might face, like whether it's that they only have 1 or 2 directions out, or whether the lane capacity doesn't seem adequate, or whether it's that the high intensity fire is likely. So we're hoping that's a starting point for discussions. And I think a lot of these points that are coming up, we're not necessarily recommending that evacuation is going to be the best option, right? Especially for some of these communities. As we all know, evacuation can be really hazardous in and of itself, of course, and there are fatalities where people get burned over trying to evacuate. So I think we're hoping that this tool can help start discussions around, is evacuation our best option? What are some of the others? Are there safety zones? Perhaps are there opportunities for hazardous fuel treatments around communities? Are there opportunities to harden homes so that homes are defensible? And sometimes those are as simple as removing leaves from gutters and making sure you don't leave a broom on your porch if you're going to evacuate. So we're hoping that this is really a starting point for discussion, and I have a feeling that there are going to be a lot of interesting discussions today.
I want to just quickly jump onto that. Yeah, I think I agree with everything that's been said, and perhaps I'd even want to stretch the framing a bit so we can begin to think about beyond the effectiveness of evacuations to also include the more kind of equity considerations around who can evacuate and why and where. And so perhaps rephrasing that question to ask a broader question, which is, how can research help people to safety? I think that would be my kind of mission statement for my research. And then in terms of takeaways from our specific research, I would emphasize that evacuation planning is deeply contextual work. It seems like there's one correct way to think about it in terms of SOPs and templates and all of that, but clearly there isn't. Evacuation planning has to be responsive to local geographies, community demographics, infrastructure, cultural values and attitudes, which has played a huge role, as we've seen. So context really matters, and it's really important that we, all of us, given all the different kinds of work that we're engaged in, that we work to understand that context. And perhaps that requires moving beyond dashboards and actually engaging with people's lived experiences of how they experience safety, how do they practice safety, and really learning from that.
Just to echo that real quick. I mean, that's the overarching umbrella beyond evacuation for the wildfire work that I've done with Amanda and many others, is about all of those different local context characteristics that lead to these different groupings of what we call archetype communities. And I would say the number one thing that they distinguish against, and we distinguish their ways that they plan for fire in different ways, but the number one longitudinal lesson and difference among those communities that we've seen all across the West is in evacuation. It isn't about when they leave, what messaging is going to work for them, whether or not they have populations who are going to help each other with that. And I will make one other point, is a lot of the work that we have around evacuation has jumped off from a behavioral standpoint, and I would say an individualistic psychological behavioral point. This is a potential opportunity, but also a challenge, because the other major point that we keep making and people are trying to push in wildfire is that wildfire is a collective issue and a collective issue problem. And so what we do sometimes find, though, is if you get people to only think about evacuation, or say this is your mitigation and the way to alleviate your problem from fire, you are actually in some ways harming that collective ability to plan and work together, and you're putting everyone on their own, which is what Shefali, I think, was getting at with you can't find your five, because you've never interacted surrounding all of the other issues that evacuation is the end point of.
Great. Thank you, everybody. We're going to go ahead and see, I think our main facilitator might be back in action.
Here's hoping that everyone can see
All
and hear
right.
me. Fantastic.
Turning it back over to you, Annie.
Nothing like a little tech fun to make a webinar exciting. So, I'm curious. One of the things that we're hearing from communities across the country right now is just this increased desire to do more evacuation modeling and even evacuation drills. These are really increasing topics of conversations in communities. And so what suggestions do you all have for communities who are in the planning phase of efforts like that?
Michael asked that same question, and I was just responding. I think, in another project that we had that was focused on both evacuation and a variety of other planning issues for communities, we went to 5 different states and we did these interactive focus groups where we were asking people to rate different strategies. And again, people differed dramatically across whether or not they had resources to bring to bear during evacuation, whether they were going to go back in, as we see in some farm areas, or if they're going to leave early. And so what we tend to get people to do is reason through a range of scenarios. And in doing that reasoning, I'm also learning something very effective, which I would hope would have some input to Karin and the work that they're doing, which is, what is people's frame of reference for how severe of a fire or how fast are they going to have these? Because that's one of the things that happens, is we all expect that there's a fire out in the distance somewhere, and there's the sirens blare, and then reverse 911 comes in. And it's oftentimes, and we've studied the psychological impact, the thing that unfortunately breaks a lot of people is when all of their ideas about what's going to happen there are thrown out the window when the extreme event occurs. And so getting people to think about all of those different contingencies is a much better strategy for making them resilient and planning for that event.
I think those practice events too have been very helpful. And sometimes it's, if you don't get a practice event and it's your first time evacuating, that kind of experience is helpful for realizing, okay, maybe we need some resilience in our evacuation plan. It's not just having multiple routes out of here, it's what happens if we don't have a route out of here because we didn't get enough notice. And that kind of ties in with, I think, a question MJ just asked and Travis might be taking a stab at, but what we were finding in some of our recent work in a paper that you all got reference to was that people who were planning to stay and defend were sometimes more likely to do the mitigation actions we were asking them to do in fire adapted communities and Firewise, right? Because they're planning on looking through their property or looking at their property through a lens of I'm going to be somebody who's staying here, versus people who are evacuating in a study Travis and our colleague Kat Edgley did. in McCall saw that people who were planning to evacuate are more likely to have those evacuation routes and things like that than shelter in place or stay and defend groups, right? So it almost might behoove us to think about, okay, what if we tell everybody, plan for the worst case, and the worst case might be you're stuck on your property and have to defend. And that might shift the lens that we're looking through and how much actual fire resilience we're promoting in some of our WUI communities.
I just want to quickly follow up on that. So from our experience, we do have some suggestions for communities in the planning phase, because as we said, our screening tool could be a great start point as a base, but the evacuation plans could be really complex. So based on our vulnerability scores, we can add some extra social vulnerability metrics or other socioeconomic indices, such as housing density, where the fire approaches from, and how about the age distribution of the local community, etc. So these factors should be fully considered in the planning phase. And in other words, we're gonna have diverse individual needs when the scenario comes. So of course, these are gonna be vital for effective evacuation plan as well.
Did any of our other panelists want to weigh in on that one? Okay, so I'm curious, what opportunities for partnerships do you all see, either with other researchers or with practitioners and communities? What do we need? Who do we need to be working with in a different way, or are there other opportunities we should be exploring?
I'll take a go at this. From our case study that we did in Larimer County, Shefali had a nice summary of that in our intro, is that when we're working in the WUI, we tend to attract and work with people that are interested in the same natural resource realm, fuels, trees, fire. But what turned out to be super important was the social connection. So the food bank, the church doing some kind of outreach, those kind of things were just venues to reach another segment of people that weren't necessarily in the natural resources part of things. So that would be something that was shouldn't have been a surprise to us, but turned out to be nice surprise that way.
Yeah, and on the research side, I think there are considerable gaps, and I think all the researchers on here will agree in how we conduct a more intersectional analysis of evacuation preferences and responses in diverse communities. I think people of color, people with disabilities, people from asylum-seeking, refugee, migrant backgrounds, thinking about gender, age, housing status, all of these need a lot deeper engagement than we've got going so far. So that's a self-critique. And that's something that I think research needs to definitely look into more.
I think there's a couple things on the research side. The first of which is, think of research when it's done rigorously as your opportunity to take stock for what people are thinking and for them to reason through some of these conditions without being wrong, right? When I go out and people send me out a lot of places, it's me going out doing interviews or workshops. And I'm the guy from the University of Idaho. I'm not one of the emergency services people. I can ask questions that sometimes will get the I'm a little scared to answer it kind of question, but it's just you. And that gives a more honest take on the side for practitioners as well. Is I know how incredibly difficult it is to be setting expectations with people and the expectations that are placed upon emergency services and practitioners to have an answer to an unanswerable question. And so I think finding a way to engage that dialogue and use people to that effect. On a more practical note, and a more moving to the other side of the spectrum. For 15 years, been saying we need to do more on stay and defend. How much money, time, and effort has gone towards modeling forest fires, fire ecology, and conditions that will burn down homes, and very, very little of it tells me if the people who are trapped in those homes will heat stroke out. Because it's a hard topic for anyone to do research on, and there's a liability concern. So at this point, I say these things, and I say these things very frankly, because I think we do need that research. Otherwise, if we kick that can down the road and don't tell people you need this breathing apparatus, or this is what it's going to look like if you have this amount of shaded fuel break on a road and you're stuck on it because there's other people on that road, that this is what's going to happen. And I think we need to do that. And the last token is the social vulnerability stuff. Amanda and I and Kat and others have done a lot with social vulnerability, downscaling stuff like Karen's work with FSIM to individual properties to look at social vulnerability. And I think social vulnerability is an incredible concept. Using it at large scales, we do not currently have the fine-grained data to do it well. Be very wary.
Yeah, I wanted to, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just to add on to like the research needs, but bring it back to the practitioner side almost. I think this research gap is also a gap we have in our policies and our programming right now, where it's very politically palatable to say fuels reduction. A lot of people that we go and talk to, it's home hardening's new. Like that's just a newer concept. They know they're 30 feet to 100 feet. They don't really realize the home materials. And I mean, Travis and I were out doing research this summer. We're walking through abandoned mines with people. We're walking through all these places that people are asking us, can I, worst case scenario, shelter in place here? So those are narratives that are going on in communities when they're not getting traction with their potential partners out there about having these conversations. They're starting to think about what are my alternatives? And it would be great if we can fill that need with both the research to back it up and then turn it into good messaging and programming.
You're muted, Annie.
You're going to have to go ahead, Emily.
We got you now.
You can go now.
We have you. Yep.
We hear you now.
Sorry, folks. It's going to be that kind of day. So if you haven't seen the fantastic conversations happening in the chat, please take a look at the great question and answer and back and forth with the researchers there. One of the questions that was populated earlier in the chat was asking specifically about whether or not anyone has linked the evacuation hazards with predicted fire occurrence under climate change scenarios. It seems like there are a lot of communities who should be planning now, but aren't shown as high hazard because data is historic.
Yeah, and this was a really interesting question because this has been the topic of quite a few discussions, and some of those have been around the recent fires that happened on the west side of the Cascades, which was an area that FSIM wasn't showing high burn probability. And that is maybe true because it's an infrequent fire regime. But another thing that is true is we did not have a wind event like that one in the historical record, that dry east wind event that came over the Cascades, and now we do. So that's maybe not a climate change example, but you get the gist here. What we're doing at the moment, because this has been a criticism of FSIM, is are we kind of hidecasting? We're using weather from 1992 to 2018. So is that exactly accurate for today's conditions? And we're working on addressing that now. The ideal way to do that, right, is if we're making simulations for, let's say we're trying to simulate next fire season, 2022, we want to have weather that is centered on 2022. So we would have weather maybe starting 15 years before that, and we kind of want to know what it's going to be like for the next 15 years. So we're going to the GCMs in order to get that kind of projection. And there's some fancy statistical handling that goes into this all that I won't bore you with, that I of course think is fascinating. But we have this just about ready to where we can run the model with weather centered on 2022 now. So I think that's going to take into account some recent changes we've seen in climate. Once we have those projections, we can transfer them over into the evacuation hazard modeling as well.
Terry had a great question in the chat, and it's about community building, and I'm going to pick up on it because I think that community, if anyone who's ever seen my work, is a massive central thread that has always gone through it. And that notion of community, of people who are willing to work together, is absolutely essential to being able to address wildfire risk in all of these WUI contexts, regardless of the diversity of people that you have. But they're going to organize differently. And so, to your point, Terry, what we're doing, and some of you on this call may get a call about Annie and I doing some interviews with you, is I've for a very long time been thinking about how do we do better assessments to figure out at what point of that community development are people at, and how do we give them different options and pathways for moving into the directions that they really need to. And I'll say that evacuation is often one of those very motivating factors, and it's tied to everything else. And so don't discount the fact or try to put it into a little box and say, here's what you need to do for evacuation. It's ready, set, go. One, not everyone's going to know what that is. Two, in some places, it's a 3-tier evacuation system. 3, in a bunch of studies that we've had, people don't know that they're not going to get all 3, or that it'll jump straight to go, and then they get confused and there's a trust component afterwards. So the more you can engage people with the ideas that we have, use them, and then adapt them so that it becomes part of their culture, the more of that community development you will do. And I think that we have some tools, and we've done workshops about how to help with that, and I'm hoping to do more of that in the future.
To kind of piggyback off of Travis a little bit, something that can be kind of daunting to managers is the fact that you're thinking of community as the administrative unit, and you'll probably realize there are vastly different communities within a given geographic space, because community is not spatial. It's very hard to make spatial. And that could be something that, when we're talking about community building in an area you're responsible for, you're actually talking about potentially multiple communities that you have to have different programming and relationships with in that space. But that's one of the ways to move forward and make your fire shed more fire resilient, is actually scaling down to that social fragmentation level.
Fantastic. So one of the last questions we have in this portion before we transition to breakouts is, what is the role of mobile apps or technology in a community that has both residents and tourists?
I've been talking a lot, but I can go. We were in an area of Wyoming, in Jackson Hole, not too long ago, me and someone else on a project, and we were looking at these exact things. Where the massive challenge in a place like that, and in many of the places you probably are, is the population at which you have to evacuate at certain times of the year is massive, because you have all these people who don't live there and they're not signed up for any of your tools or anything else. And so I think there is a lot more work that needs to be done about that, and actually being able to put something on the ground to be able to get those people out, or estimates of what those people could do. Or again, in those areas, establishing some places where people can go for that pass of an event. As far as the apps are concerned, I think they're wonderful and these tools are great. But again, in every of the places that we've gone, you also have a tremendous amount of misinformation that can occur. None of us have seen any misinformation on social media in the last few years. It happens in fires too, and has this entire time. And so more work on potentially how that messaging can direct people to trusted sources, even within their own community, or to establish people, as we often tell them, to be your central point of concern, but also have 5 backups in there in case that person's on vacation. Ways to localize that information dissemination.
I'm curious for fun, and Karin, if you've seen any push to utilize some of your spatial modeling in a way that's more real-time, app-based, or accessible to communities during evacuations.
Thanks, Annie. I can talk a little bit about it. That's a great point. Either to integrate our spatial analysis on the mobile apps, or integrate GIS products there. Actually, I think that's one direction we can go in the future. In fact, I think one of the direction we can go is to add in more temporal features, like traffic simulations, right? And give it opportunity for local communities or tourists, like they can observe the patterns nearly real time. That'll be great, but let's add in more temporal features. That's awesome too. And also that's a good way, once we have some mobile apps with the scores, with the rankings, give them a general idea where they locate. And it's also, if you have such mobile apps, it is a good place, a platform for it to collect some response from our local communities. But I don't see many on mobile apps, but I did see a lot of interactive maps integrated in their risk assessment. So it's a great way to visualize and map out the spatial patterns. But of course, if we integrate more temporal features, that would be awesome. What is probability for the next fire gonna occur, or what is the current topographic or climatology related features? That should be very helpful.
And to tag team onto that a little bit, some of you who are in the Pacific Northwest might know Rick Stratton with the Forest Service there. He was running a team that used to be called the RMAT, the Risk Management Assessment Team, and I think it's been rechristened something else, but they provide a number of tools that are used on active incidents, and incident commanders can order those. So this tool was provided to them this summer, and I checked in with Rick to see if we had gotten much feedback yet, and we haven't heard much back. So that doesn't speak to the real-time aspect of it, but it could be used potentially as a screening tool when you have a lot of active incidents in one region.
I just wanted to also make a comment that, going off of what Shefali was saying earlier as well, this idea of apps and those kind of networked kind of Wi-Fi infrastructure-based things are going to be useful for a certain population or certain parts of our evacuating community. Folks in some of our mountains where AT&T, like if you're in California, PSPS events go with wildfire season. Those are communities that are at risk and going to be missing potentially notifications. A lot of those folks, right, the apps can still be helpful if they're plugged into their millennial children in the cities, because that's what some of the people who stayed and defended were doing. They were going to high points where they got signal, calling their daughters, getting the size up of the fire behavior and talking about what they were seeing on the maps, then going back and doing their decision making from there. But we need to also be thinking about how we're going to get that information from those apps, maybe to some areas living in the WUI that are at high risk.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thanks to our fantastic panelists. Thank you for weighing in on that. The questions in the chat. I saw some really specific and very directed questions that I'm hoping will come up in your breakout rooms. And so